The ballroom of the Grand Joseon Hotel had been Veronica's idea. Every detail. The ivory calla lilies cascading down the centerpieces. The custom calligraphy signage blending Hangul and English. The live jazz quartet playing Coltrane before the Korean fusion band took the stage. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of pouring herself, her mind, her creativity, her cultural grace, into a life built beside a man she had loved with everything she had. She stood at the entrance in a gown the color of midnight, her natural curls swept into an elaborate updo adorned with gold pins, her dark skin luminous under the chandelier light. Veronica had always known how to command a room simply by existing in it. Tonight, she told herself, would be no different. Tonight was their anniversary. Tonight was a celebration of what they had built together. She checked her watch. Hwang Dongsoo was 30 minutes late. The whispers began before she saw them. She noticed the parting of the crowd first, that instinctive way people step back when something uncomfortable enters a room. Then the clicking of heels she did not recognize. Then the murmur of her own name, said too softly, carried on breath meant to stay hidden. And then she saw him. Dongsoo walked in with Ji-yeon on his arm as though she were the one who belonged there. Ji-yeon, in a blood-red dress, her glossy hair falling like a curtain over one bare shoulder, her hand resting on Dongsoo's forearm with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing this entrance for months. Maybe longer. Veronica did not move. She did not breathe. She simply watched as her husband, the man whose empire bore her fingerprints on every wall, crossed the room she had designed and smiled at guests she had personally invited, with another woman pressed to his side. The room held its breath. And then Dongsoo met Veronica's eyes. He did not falter. He did not flinch. He tilted his chin, looked away, and leaned down to say something in Ji-yeon's ear that made the woman laugh, bright, deliberate, theatrical. Something broke inside Veronica that night. But what those watching would never understand, what they could not have predicted, was that the thing that broke was not her dignity. It was not her will. It was not her future. What broke was the last remaining piece of mercy she had been holding for Hwang Dongsoo. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse above the Han River, a man named Kang Min-jae received a phone call. He listened in silence. When the caller finished, he set down his glass of whiskey slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that made men afraid. She built that empire, he said quietly. And he brought another woman to her table. A long pause. No, he said. I will not let that stand. Hey everyone, real quick. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Where are you watching from today? And if you were Veronica, what would you do if your husband publicly humiliated you like that with his mistress? Let me know below. She had never intended to fall in love in Seoul. Veronica Clarke had arrived in South Korea on a 3-week consulting contract, brought in by a mid-sized tech firm looking to penetrate the North American market. She was 28 years old, armed with an MBA from Northwestern, 6 years of razor-sharp marketing experience, and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from being told you are brilliant your whole life, but from having proved it, over and over, in rooms that did not initially want to make space for you. Chicago had formed her. The South Side specifically, where her mother had raised her and her 2 younger brothers in a house that was always warm even when money was tight. Her mother, Claudette, pressed her clothes on Sunday mornings and told her, "Baby, you walk into every room like you already belong. Because you do." Those words had become the architecture of Veronica's spine. She carried them everywhere, including into the glass towers of Seoul, where she quickly learned that the business world was a performance, and she was a natural performer. She met Hwang Dongsoo at an industry mixer in Gangnam 3 days into her trip. He was not the most powerful man in the room that night, not yet. But he was the most magnetic. Tall for a Korean man, with broad shoulders and a jaw that looked sculpted by someone with strong opinions about beauty. He laughed loudly and unapologetically, which struck her as unusual in the more reserved professional circles she had been navigating. He had an energy that pulled people toward him without seeming to try. He spoke English with confidence and occasional charming grammatical errors that made him seem more human, not less impressive. He approached her at the bar, not with the fumbling uncertainty she had grown accustomed to from men who found her intimidating, but with the directness of someone who had decided he wanted to know her before he had even introduced himself. "I've been watching you work the room," he said. "You're better at this than anyone here." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it surprises you." "It doesn't," he said simply. "It impresses me. There's a difference." That was how it began. What Veronica learned about Dongsoo over the following weeks would have given a more cautious woman pause. He was not simply a businessman, not entirely. He operated in the gray territories of Seoul's underground economy, moving between the legitimate world of logistics and import-export and the far less legitimate world of the Hwang Syndicate, which had been his family's domain for 2 generations. He was honest about this in the measured way of a man who does not lie so much as he curates the truth. He told her he had ambitions that reached beyond what his syndicate offered, that he wanted legitimacy, that he wanted to build something the world could see in daylight. What he did not tell her, what she would piece together only later, was that he wanted those things partly because he needed them, and he recognized in her a mind that could help him get them. But love is rarely a clean thing, and what Veronica felt for Dongsoo was real. She felt it in the way she found herself thinking about him in the mornings, in the particular kind of attentiveness he showed her, the way he listened when she spoke, genuinely, as though her words were something worth collecting. He flew her to Jeju Island on their first real date. He cooked for her in his apartment in a clumsy, determined way that made her laugh for an hour. He asked about her family back in Chicago, about her mother, about the brothers she called every Sunday, and he remembered what she told him. She extended her contract. Then extended it again. Then stopped counting. When he proposed 8 months later, simply in his apartment, with a ring he had chosen himself and a speech that was more honest than poetic, she said yes without hesitation. Marriage to Dongsoo in the early years was genuinely good. Not perfect, nothing is, but substantively, meaningfully good. They were partners in the truest sense. Veronica threw herself into helping him build the legitimate face of his empire, a holding company called HW Strategic Group, which she rebranded, repositioned, and shepherded into conversations with investors and venture firms that had previously ignored the Hwang name. She was the one who understood how Western capital thought, how to reframe a story, how to make the right people feel comfortable enough to write checks. She built the marketing architecture from nothing. She managed communications. She flew to New York, to London, to Dubai, representing him in meetings where her presence alone signaled a kind of worldliness and credibility that Dongsoo was still cultivating. He told her often in those years that she was the best decision he had ever made. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? It seemed true. Their home in the Hanamdong district was a reflection of them both. His taste for clean Korean minimalism, her insistence on color and texture and life. They hosted dinner parties that became legendary in their circle, Veronica cooking dishes that blended the flavors of her Chicago upbringing with Korean ingredients she had taught herself to love. She learned the language with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything. Not perfectly, never claiming perfection, but enough to make his mother smile with surprised approval and his business associates respect her in a way that went beyond courtesy. She was building a life. A real one. But power changes people in ways that love cannot always see clearly. As HW Strategic Group grew, as Dongsoo's name began to carry real weight not just in the underworld but in the legitimate corridors of Korean business, a subtle but distinct shift began. It was slow, like water finding its way through stone. So slow that Veronica, for longer than she would later be comfortable admitting, told herself it was her imagination. The first sign was the meetings she was no longer invited to join. Then the decisions made without her input, presented to her as done deals. Then the evenings he came home later and later, smelling of cigarettes and expensive whiskey and a kind of restless distance she could not name. Then Ji-yeon. She appeared first in the periphery, a face in a photograph from a business dinner, a name mentioned once and then avoided, an energy that Veronica noticed in the way Dongsoo's posture changed when certain calls came in. Ji-yeon had been a high-end model before pivoting into what people politely called brand consulting, which in the circles Dongsoo was now moving in meant being beautiful and well-connected and willing to make powerful men feel as though their ambitions were limitless. Veronica's intelligence was not decorative. She noticed. She catalogued. She waited. And the first real fracture appeared not in a dramatic scene but in a quiet one. A Sunday morning when she asked Dongsoo if he was happy, and he paused a half-second too long before answering. That pause lived in her chest for weeks like something swallowed wrong. She did not yet know how bad it would get. But the woman who had walked into Seoul 4 years earlier, curious, formidable, open-hearted, was beginning to read the room. And what she read made her grief-stricken and furious and deeply, privately afraid. Not for herself. For what she had given, and what was slowly becoming clear she would not get to keep. Distance in a marriage is not always loud. Sometimes it is the sound of 2 people sleeping in the same bed and reaching for each other in the dark and finding only cold air. Sometimes it is dinner conversations that stay determinately, exhaustingly surface level. Sometimes it is the particular way a man stops asking about your day, not with cruelty but with a kind of unconscious reclassification, as though you have been quietly moved from the category of person he is fascinated by to fixture of the life he is outgrowing. Dongsoo did not stop loving Veronica all at once. That would have been easier. It happened in gradations, the way a tide goes out, barely noticeable until suddenly the shoreline is exposed and the ground looks different than you remembered it. By the 4th year of their marriage, the changes in him had calcified into something Veronica could no longer explain away. He had been fully absorbed into the upper echelon of Seoul's power world, not merely the Hwang syndicate's cleaner operations, but the elaborate, interconnected web of elite Korean businessmen who straddled legitimacy and criminality with practiced elegance. These men had specific ideas about image, about wives, about what a man of Dongsoo's rising stature ought to project. Ji-yeon had been whispering in his ear for at least a year before Veronica knew her name clearly. She was not unaware. Veronica Clarke had not survived the South Side, Northwestern's competitive MBA program, and years of being the only black woman in the room by being naive. She knew what was happening. She had simply, with the particular kind of heartbroken stubbornness that belongs to people who have built something real with someone, chosen to keep fighting for what she believed the marriage still could be. That choice would cost her. Ji-yeon's campaign was sophisticated, which Veronica could grudgingly appreciate even as it destroyed her. Ji-yeon did not make the amateur's mistake of simply seducing Dongsoo's body. She seduced his ego. She whispered to him about image, about legacy, about how men of his stature were perceived in the highest Korean circles, where the unspoken rule was that a wife should be a particular kind of ornament, and that ornament, the implication went, should be recognizably Korean. She did not say these things crudely. She said them in the silken language of concern, of counsel, of a woman who just wanted what was best for him. "You have worked so hard," Ji-yeon would say, her hand on his arm in some restaurant Veronica was never invited to. "Don't let anything hold you back from where you deserve to be." Anything. A carefully chosen word. Not anyone. Anything. Like Veronica was not a woman but an obstacle, a stylistic miscalculation, a paragraph in a press release that needed to be rewritten. Dongsoo, drunk on new power and the particular flattery of a woman who seemed to exist entirely to affirm him, began to absorb this framing. The armor of it went on piece by piece. Each piece made him colder. The yacht party happened in August at the height of summer. One of Dongsoo's senior business associates, Park Sung-hyun, had invited their circle to spend a weekend on a luxury charter in the waters off Busan. It was the kind of event that was equal parts celebration and networking, equal parts visible and calculated. The guest list was a roster of elite names, politicians' wives, entertainment industry investors, 2 members of the National Assembly who everyone pretended did not know about the other business being conducted. Veronica had attended a dozen such events and moved through them with the ease of a woman who had stopped being nervous in rooms like this years ago. She dressed carefully, a burnt orange silk wrap dress that complemented her skin in a way that had turned heads at every event she wore it to, her hair in defined curls that she had perfected over 3 years of learning what humidity did in Korean summers. She was objectively radiant. For the first 2 hours, everything seemed normal. She worked the room with the practiced warmth she had developed, knowing names, asking the right questions, making each conversation feel like the most important one happening in the room. Dongsoo stayed close enough to appear present, distant enough that she could feel the glass between them. Then Park Sung-hyun's wife, a carefully preserved woman named Mi-soo, approached Veronica at the railing with a glass of champagne and an expression that was the social equivalent of a loaded weapon wrapped in silk. "You are so brave," Mi-soo said in Korean with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Coming to these events. Everyone talks about how modern Dongsoo is." Veronica's Korean was good enough. She understood every word. "Modern," she repeated in Korean, keeping her voice perfectly level. "Interesting word." Mi-soo's smile flickered. She had not expected Veronica to respond in Korean. "I only mean, it takes a special kind of confidence. You must be very secure." "I am," Veronica said simply and turned back to the sea. But her hands on the railing had tightened. Behind her sunglasses, her eyes were burning, not with tears, but with the particular fury of a woman who understands she is being condescended to by someone half as accomplished as she is, and must choose in this moment between dignity and retaliation. She chose dignity. What she did not see was Dongsoo 10 meters away watching the exchange, watching Mi-soo's expression of barely concealed satisfaction, and doing nothing, saying nothing, simply looking away. Later in the cabin they shared, she told him what had happened. She was calm. She was precise. She laid it out the way she laid out marketing strategy, clearly, with evidence, with expectation of response. Dongsoo said, "Mi-soo is harmless. You're being too sensitive." 5 words. "You're being too sensitive." Veronica looked at her husband for a long moment. She searched his face for the man who had once told her she was the best decision he had ever made. She found very little of him there. "I'm going to sleep," she said. She lay in the dark for a long time after he fell asleep beside her, listening to the water against the hull, cataloging what she knew and what she feared and what she was beginning to accept. She had not wept. She had not broken. But something in her had gone still, the way an ocean goes still before the weather turns, and in that stillness, a quieter, more resolute version of herself was beginning to take shape. She did not know yet what she would do. But she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has survived everything she has survived, that she would not be broken quietly. The anniversary gala was Veronica's masterpiece. She had spent 6 weeks designing it, coordinating with the Grand Joseon's events team, selecting vendors with the meticulous attention to quality that defined everything she produced. She had written the program herself, choosing music that told the story of their life together. The jazz of her Chicago years, the Korean ballads that had become the soundtrack of her Seoul years, and then something hybrid and original, a commissioned piece for a quartet that blended both traditions. She had done all of this because she still believed, or because she needed to, or because the act of building something beautiful was the way she had always coped with the feeling that something was falling apart. She would understand the difference only later. She arrived at the Grand Joseon at 6, 2 hours before guests, to walk through every detail personally. The flowers were perfect. The lighting was warm and precise. The calligraphy signage, 5 years. 1 story, was hung at exactly the angle she had specified. She stood in the center of the empty ballroom and allowed herself one quiet moment of pride, one breath of acknowledgement that she had done something extraordinary here. Then she smoothed her gown, lifted her chin, and prepared to receive guests. The first 100 arrived in the pattern she had designed. Business associates first, building the room toward intimacy, then the closer circle, then family friends, and finally, at 8 o'clock, Dongsoo himself, arriving last with the theatrical entrance she had choreographed to center him in the room's attention. At 8 o'clock she stood at the entrance, waiting. At 8:30 she stood at the entrance, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, while the conversations around her grew careful. At 8:45 the crowd parted. She had written of this moment before, had drafted it in her imagination in the dark hours on the yacht, in the mornings when Dongsoo came home too late and left too early. She had told herself she was prepared. She was not prepared. Dongsoo entered in a bespoke charcoal suit, immaculate, composed, and gorgeous in the way that felt like a personal cruelty. Ji-yeon was on his arm, radiant in crimson, her expression arranged into the particular kind of pleased serenity that belongs to women who know they are winning. They walked through the crowd together with the ease of a couple who had rehearsed this, who had decided that the most devastating thing they could do was make it look casual. Veronica's body went cold from her feet upward. She did not move. She commanded herself, with every ounce of the discipline she had built across 3 decades of being underestimated and overperforming. You will not move. You will not cry. You will not give this room the thing it is waiting to see. Dongsoo reached her. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name, not guilt, not cruelty, but something adjacent to indifference, as though she were someone he had once known who now occupied a complicated position in his social calendar. "Veronica," he said. A greeting. Just her name. No warmth, no apology, no acknowledgement of what he had done or was doing. "Dongsoo," she said, and her voice was steady. She would be proud of this for the rest of her life. Ji-yeon, beside him, smiled at Veronica with the particular expression of a woman who wants you to know she has won without making it look like she is gloating. What happened next happened quickly, and in a way that Veronica had not anticipated, because for all her intelligence, for all her preparation, she had not quite believed that Dongsoo would take it this far. He spoke to her in Korean, in a voice low enough that only she and Ji-yeon could hear, while around them the room maintained its careful, watching performance of normalcy. "This needs to end cleanly," he said. "The lawyers will contact you next week. Tonight I need you to." "You brought her here," Veronica said in English slowly, with the particular precision of a woman ensuring each word lands exactly where she is throwing it. "To our anniversary. That you asked me to plan." "Veronica." His voice had an edge now. "Say what you need to say," she said. "Then let me tell you what happens next." But she did not get the chance. Because in the next moment, Park Sung-hyun, Misu's husband, the man whose yacht had borne witness to the first public humiliation, approached with 2 members of security from the event team. Not Veronica's security. Dongsoo's. "There's a car waiting," Sung-hyun said, addressing her, his voice carefully neutralized as though she were a guest who had mistakenly arrived at the wrong party. Veronica looked at the two security men. She looked at Sung-hyun. She looked at Dongsoo, who was not meeting her eyes. Then she looked at Ji-yeon, who was, to her credit or damnation, at least looking directly at her. Veronica said nothing for a long 10 seconds. Then she said, "I'll get my coat." She retrieved it herself. She walked out of that ballroom, her ballroom designed with her hands and her mind and her love, with her back straight and her head level, and not a single person in that crowd of 200 witnessed anything on her face that they could call weakness. She sat in the car. She watched Seoul move past the windows, the lights blurring in the wet November air. And when the car had traveled far enough from the hotel that she was certain she was alone, she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed through her nose, once, twice, a third time, until the sharp animal grief of it settled from a roar to something she could carry. Then she opened her phone. She had started collecting evidence 6 months ago. Quietly. Methodically. Financial records from the accounts she had co-managed. Correspondence she had been copied on. Contracts she had negotiated that bore her signature. Intellectual property documentation. Audio recordings, legal in their jurisdiction, of meetings she had attended where her strategic contributions had been made plain. She sent everything to a secure encrypted server in Chicago. Then she booked a flight. And in a penthouse 2 districts away, a man named Kang Min-jae was being told about what had happened at the Grand Joseon Hotel. He had known Veronica, known of her, respected her, from a business mediation 2 years prior, where she had walked into a room of men who expected to intimidate her and had instead walked out having restructured a deal that benefited 3 parties and humiliated none. He had admired the precision of it. He had remembered her name. She walked out with her head up, his informant told him. Kang Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "Of course she did," he said. He poured another glass of whiskey. He did not drink it. He simply sat in the particular stillness of a man deciding what kind of response a situation deserves. When he finally spoke again, his voice was very soft. That was always when his people knew to pay closest attention. "Find out where she's going," he said. "And make sure she gets there safely." Veronica landed in London on a grey Tuesday morning. She had chosen London deliberately, not Chicago, not somewhere Dongsoo's network would expect, not somewhere that would require her to immediately explain herself to the people who loved her. She needed to be somewhere she could be anonymous for a little while. Somewhere she could breathe the particular air of a city that had been rebuilding itself from catastrophe for centuries, and let that energy seep into her bones. She rented a flat in Notting Hill, small but beautiful, with high ceilings and a window that looked onto a garden that was going quietly brown for winter. She put her suitcase in the bedroom. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and did not move for 40 minutes. Then she opened her laptop. The grief had not gone away. She was not the kind of woman who could amputate emotion with surgical precision, nor would she want to be. She felt the loss of her marriage in her body, in the particular ache of the mornings when she reached for her phone to text someone who was no longer her person. She felt the humiliation of that ballroom in the pit of her stomach, a hot, roiling thing that she would need to process eventually, carefully, with the same intelligence she brought to everything else. But grief and strategy were not mutually exclusive. Claudette Clarke had not raised a daughter who waited for her pain to pass before she began building again. She spent the first week organizing. Everything she had gathered, the financial records, the contracts, the documented contributions to HW Strategic Group's growth, she catalogued with the precision of a woman who had once overhauled the marketing infrastructure of a criminal empire and made it look like legitimate genius. She called an attorney in London and one in Seoul. She called a financial forensics expert she had met through a conference 3 years ago and had kept carefully in her network for no specific reason except that she had known, somehow, that capable people should never be lost. She did not call Dongsoo. She did not respond to his single, perfunctory text that arrived 2 days after her departure. A text that read, "The lawyers will be in touch," with the emotional warmth of a parking citation. She let him think she had retreated. Meanwhile, in Seoul, Dongsoo and Ji-yeon were enjoying what Ji-yeon had designed to feel like a beginning. Ji-yeon moved into the Hanam-dong house with the efficiency of a woman who had been staging this transition in her mind for months. She redecorated selectively, removing the pieces that were unmistakably Veronica's without being so aggressive that it would look obvious. She attended the social events on Dongsoo's arm with the practiced ease of someone who had been practicing for this role longer than anyone knew. She was photographed at his side. She smiled at the right cameras. She was, to the external world, a seamless replacement. But seamlessness is not the same as depth. The cracks began appearing within weeks. The first was small, a business presentation to a group of American investors that went badly because no one on Dongsoo's team had the cross-cultural fluency to manage the room. Veronica had always managed those rooms. Her absence was a gap that Ji-yeon's beauty could not fill and Dongsoo's charisma could not paper over. The second was larger, a key partner in HW Strategic Group's European expansion, a man named Andreas Bauer who had invested heavily on the basis of a relationship he had built with Veronica specifically, quietly began renegotiating terms. When Dongsoo called him to understand why, Bauer was polite and circumspect and ultimately said, "The structure has changed. We need to reassess." What he did not say but meant, she was why we came in. Without her we are less certain. The third crack was financial. One of the accounts Veronica had managed, a discretionary fund tied to HW Strategic's marketing operations, had been flagged by their auditors for irregularities. Not fraud, nothing that simple. Just the particular kind of complexity that arises when someone who deeply understands a financial architecture is no longer there to maintain it, and everyone else is discovering they understood less than they thought. Dongsoo, still surfing the early euphoria of his liberation from a marriage he had convinced himself was holding him back, dismissed these signals. Ji-yeon, who understood nothing about the actual mechanics of what Veronica had built, could offer him no counsel that was worth having. In a Notting Hill flat, Veronica finished her tea, closed her laptop, and allowed herself a small, contained smile. She was not celebrating yet. She was too careful for that, too disciplined to mistake the opening of a chess game for its conclusion. But she could see the board. She had always been able to see the board. She picked up her phone and called her mother. "Baby," Claudette said when she answered. "You sound like yourself again." "I'm getting there," Veronica said. "Are you safe?" "I'm safe." "Are you eating?" Despite everything, Veronica laughed. A real one, the first since the ballroom. "Yes, Mama. I'm eating." "Then you're going to be fine," Claudette said, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had raised her daughter to bend in storms without breaking. "You hear me? Whatever he did, you are going to be fine." She stayed on the phone for an hour. When she hung up, the flat felt less silent. She went back to the laptop. She had documents to review, a strategy to complete, and a future to construct from the rubble of a marriage that had underestimated her in its dying. Dongsoo had assumed that removing Veronica from his life meant removing her from the equation. He was going to learn that those were not the same thing at all. The message came through a secure channel she had not created. Veronica was in the middle of a morning workout, 30 minutes of structured movement she had reinstated as part of reclaiming her daily rhythm, when her phone displayed an encrypted message from a number that resolved, after a moment's searching, to an intermediary she did not recognize. "Kang Min-jae wishes to speak with you at your convenience. He sends his respects and asks that you know you are under no obligation of any kind. If you are willing, arrangements will be made wherever you are." She stood in the center of her Notting Hill flat in her workout clothes and read the message twice. Kang Min-jae. The name sat in her mind with a weight she recognized. She had met him only once, but that once had been enough to understand what he was. Not merely what he did, but what he was. He was the kind of man that entire ecosystems of power orbited without quite acknowledging. The kind of man who did not need to raise his voice because when he spoke, the room rearranged itself to listen. She had worked indirectly with his organization 2 years ago, a contract mediation in which HW Strategic Group had been attempting to formalize a partnership with a logistics firm that had long-standing ties to Kang's network. She had been the lead on Dongsoo's side. The negotiation had been complex, three-party, and rife with the kind of unspoken tensions that only someone fluent in multiple cultural registers could navigate without catastrophe. She had navigated it brilliantly. When it concluded, Kang Min-jae, who had attended only the final session for 20 minutes as a formality, had caught her eye across the table and given her the smallest, most precise nod of acknowledgement she had ever received. She had understood it then. She understood its memory now in the light of what he was offering. She wrote back, "I'm in London. I'm happy to speak by video if that works, or I can travel if the matter warrants it." The response came within 20 minutes. "He prefers in person. He can come to London or arrange somewhere neutral. He will take whichever you prefer." He would come to her. That was not a small thing. Kang Min-jae came to very few people. Generally people came to him. The gesture was calibrated, a statement of respect, deliberate as everything he did. She thought about it for 1 hour. Then she replied, "London is fine. I'll send an address." They met 4 days later in a private dining room of a members' club in Mayfair, one of those discreetly excellent establishments where powerful people conduct conversations that could not happen in restaurants where others might listen. Veronica had arrived first, intentionally, old habit, wanting to be the one who owned the room's initial silence. Kang Min-jae arrived exactly on time with one associate who stayed outside the door. He was not what popular imagination constructed when it pictured a Korean mafia boss. He was 53, lean, dressed with the understated elegance of a man who had long since moved past the need to signal his wealth through what he wore. His hair was silver at the temples. His eyes were dark and unreadably still, the eyes of a man who had practiced seeing everything and revealing nothing for decades. He carried himself with a quietness that occupied space in a way that loudness never could. He bowed to her formally when he entered. She returned it. They sat. The club staff had been arranged to provide complete privacy. Wine was poured and left. The room settled into its own held breath. "Mrs. Hwang," he began. "Miss Clarke," she corrected without heat. "I've returned to my name." Something moved across his expression, too brief and too controlled to be called a smile, but in the territory of one. "Miss Clarke," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." "You came a long way," she said. "I assumed you had something specific to say." "I do." He folded his hands on the table. "I heard what happened at the Grand Joseon." The ballroom flashed through her mind, the parting crowd, Dongsoo's face, Ji-yeon's practiced smile, the security guard's careful politeness. She allowed herself to feel it for 1 second, then set it aside. "And," she said. "And," he said, "I found it deeply offensive." The simplicity of it surprised her. Not the elaborate political calculation she might have expected. Not the coded language of men who operated in metaphors and implications. Just, "I found it offensive." "Why?" she asked. "Because you built something real," he said. "I watched you work 2 years ago. I have followed what you contributed since. You gave that man your intelligence, your credibility, and your years, and he brought another woman to the table you designed." Pause. "In my world there are very few rules that everyone agrees on. One of them is, you do not disrespect a person who helped build what you have. That is not sentiment. That is code." Veronica listened to all of this. She let it land. She did not immediately respond, because she was not a woman who filled silences with reassurance. Finally she said, "What are you offering me?" He met her gaze directly. "Protection first. Dongsoo does not know where you are, I ensured that. But his instincts will turn toward pressure when his situation deteriorates further, which it will. I want to ensure he cannot reach you while he is panicking." "And in exchange?" "Nothing." He said it with absolute flatness. "I am not making a transaction. I am correcting a wrong within my sphere of influence. You owe me nothing. If you wish to have nothing to do with me afterward, I will respect that entirely." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without performance. "What happens to Dongsoo?" she asked. "That," he said quietly, "is a separate matter. I want to know." "He will face the consequences of his decisions," Kang Min-jae said. "In business and otherwise. People who disrespect their partners invite the withdrawal of goodwill from those watching. Goodwill is the architecture beneath everything that appears solid." Veronica thought about the crack in the European partnership. The flagged accounts. The American investors who had trusted her specifically. "He's already starting to feel it," she said. "Yes," said Kang Min-jae. "It will get worse." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I don't want to be used as a weapon against him." "You won't be," he said without hesitation. "You are not a weapon. You are a person who was wronged and who deserves to move forward without his shadow on you." Something in her chest loosened slightly. Not because she needed a man's protection to feel safe, she had never operated from that premise. But because there was something in being acknowledged, truly, specifically acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement meant something in the world where the injury had occurred, that she had not realized she needed. "All right," she said. She picked up her wine. "Tell me what you know about what's happening to HW Strategic Group." He told her. It took an hour. And as she listened, Veronica Clarke felt for the first time since November that the game, far from being over, was only now beginning to go in the direction she had always known it could. Dongsoo was not a man who frightened easily. He had grown up in the margins of the Hwang syndicate, had watched his father navigate threats with cold pragmatism, had cultivated his own ruthlessness through years of strategic survival in Seoul's underworld. He understood danger the way a person who has lived with weather understands storms, not without fear, but with the particular competence of familiarity. But in the 6 weeks following the Grand Joseon Gala, Dongsoo began experiencing something adjacent to fear. It began, as Veronica had observed from her quiet London vantage point, with the business erosions. Andreas Bauer's renegotiation. The American investor cluster's chilly recalibration. The flagged accounts. These he had managed to explain away to himself through the particular mental gymnastics of a man who needed to believe that the problems around him were unrelated to his own choices. Then the social erosions began. 3 separate meetings with partners in his syndicate hierarchy were rescheduled with explanations that were polite and implausible. An invitation to a key industry event, one that Dongsoo had attended for 4 consecutive years as a matter of visible prestige, quietly failed to arrive. When he sent an inquiry, the response was warm and apologetic and mentioned a capacity issue in the tone of a lie that both parties understood was a lie. Then his lieutenant, a man named Cho who had served the Hwang operation for 8 years, came to him and said, with the careful discomfort of someone delivering information they wish they did not have, "There are conversations happening that don't include us. I don't know who is directing them, but it's coordinated. Someone with significant reach is pulling threads." Dongsoo listened to this with his face arranged into stillness, then dismissed Cho and sat in his office alone. He thought through the list of people who had the reach to do this. It was not a long list. And when he reached the name at the top of the list, the name that sat above all the others the way a summit sits above foothills, his stomach dropped in a way it had not done in years. Kang Min-jae. The question was why. Kang had no personal grievance with Dongsoo, or so he had believed. Their organizations had overlapping interests in some territories and were careful to maintain a respectful distance in others. Dongsoo had never crossed Kang directly. He had never done anything so profoundly foolish as to invite the attention of a man who operated 3 levels above him in the hierarchy of real power. Unless. He sat with the unless for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and called Ji-yeon. She arrived at the office within the hour, still in the manner of a woman who was settling into a life she had engineered, her confidence undiminished. She sat across from him in the chair that had once been Veronica's preferred seat for their working meetings, and listened as he laid out what Cho had told him. "You think it's connected to Veronica," she said. He looked at her. "Dongsoo," she said, and there was the first faint trace of something defensive in her voice. "She left. She went to London. She has no syndicate connections. Kang Min-jae met with her," he said. He did not know this for certain. But he watched Ji-yeon's face when he said it, and what he saw there confirmed enough. Ji-yeon recovered quickly. She was, whatever else, composed. "How would you even know that?" "Because it's the only explanation for the scale of this," he said. "Single business problems look like single business problems. What I'm experiencing looks like someone coordinating. And there is only one person in my circle with a connection to Kang Min-jae's level." Ji-yeon said, "She's a marketing consultant." "She's not. She built this company," Dongsoo said. The words came out of him with a sudden flatness that silenced the room. "I know that. I have always known that. I chose to forget it because you told me it was acceptable to forget it." Ji-yeon went very still. "And now someone who respected her work and who watched me disrespected in the most public way possible," he said, his voice low, "has decided that this will not stand." A long silence. "What are you going to do?" Ji-yeon asked. "I'm going to try to fix it," he said. But even as he said it, something in his voice carried the tone of a man who suspects that certain things cannot be fixed, only paid for. He made his overtures carefully. A message sent through a third party to Kang Min-jae's organization, requesting a meeting. A gesture of willingness to discuss terms. He framed it as he framed most things in the language of business. Neutral, transactional, stripped of the emotional core that he did not know how to address. The response came back in 3 words. "The boss will consider it." He did not know what that meant. He was not sure he wanted to. In London, Veronica received a summary of Dongsoo's outreach from a secure contact Kang Min-jae had quietly positioned to keep her informed. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She had promised herself she would not gloat. She intended to keep that promise. Not because she felt Dongsoo deserved her grace, but because gloating was the emotional signature of people who needed external confirmation of their own worth. Veronica had always known her worth. She did not need his downfall to prove it. But there was, in the very quiet center of her, something that she could only describe as rest. The bone-deep rest of a woman who has stopped carrying a weight she should never have been given and is only now feeling the relief of its absence. She finished her tea. She called her attorney in Seoul to review the latest updates to her legal filings. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting the business plan for the company she was going to build. Her company. Her name. Her vision. built from the architecture of everything she knew and everything she had survived. It would be, she was already certain, extraordinary. The message from Kang Min-jae's organization arrived in a form that Dongsoo recognized as a summons disguised as an invitation. Mr. Kang will see you Thursday. 6 o'clock. The address is attached. The address was a private club in the heart of Yongu, Seoul, not the flashy venues of aspirational power, but the quiet old-money establishments where the real decisions about the city's invisible architecture had been made for generations. Dongsoo had been inside twice before, on the arm of men who were more connected than he was. He had never arrived there as a principal. He dressed with the particular care of a man preparing for a confrontation he cannot fully anticipate. He told Ji-yeon only that he had a meeting. She asked questions he did not answer. Something in his demeanor had shifted in the past week, a quality of distraction, almost of preoccupation, that Ji-yeon had not seen in him before. She did not like it. She told herself it was temporary. Dongsoo arrived at the club at 5:55. He was brought through a corridor he had never seen before. The building was layered with rooms that existed only for specific conversations, and stopped at a heavy wooden door. He adjusted his jacket. He breathed. The associate opened the door. The room was small and exquisitely appointed. Dark wood, low light, a table set for 3. There was already a bottle of whiskey open on the table. There was already someone seated. Kang Min-jae sat at the head of the table. And to his right, in a chair that she occupied with the unhurried ease of a woman exactly where she had decided to be, was Veronica. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress that set against her skin like something sculpted. Her hair was down, her natural curls, the one she had worn in exactly this way on the first night Dongsoo had ever seen her. Her expression was composed. Not cold. Not triumphant. Not even angry. Just present. Entirely, formidably present. Dongsoo stopped moving. The door closed behind him. Kang Min-jae gestured to the chair across from them with the economy of a man who expects his gestures to be obeyed. Dongsoo sat. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence in the room was the particular kind that has weight to it, that has been engineered rather than arrived at accidentally. Kang Min-jae poured 3 glasses of whiskey. He slid one to Veronica. He slid one to Dongsoo. He kept the third for himself. A ritual of apparent equality that both men in the room understood was not an equality at all. I think you know why you're here, Kang Min-jae said. I have an idea, Dongsoo said carefully. His eyes kept moving to Veronica, who was looking at him with an evenness that he found more difficult to process than anger would have been. Then I will be brief, Kang said. I do not like to waste words. He set his glass down. You built something real. It did not come from you alone. You had a partner whose mind and work and sacrifice contributed in ways that you have attempted to erase. You then went further. You caused her public humiliation at an event she designed, in a city she adapted to, in a life she built with you. Dongsoo opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Kang Min-jae said, with a softness that was more silencing than any shout. Dongsoo closed his mouth. The disrespect you showed her, Kang continued, was a disrespect to the principle that I have built my entire operation on, that loyalty and real contribution are rewarded, and their betrayal carries consequences. Not because of sentiment. Because without that principle nothing we build holds. Everything becomes provisional. Everything becomes available to the next person willing to make a crueler calculation. He turned his eyes to Dongsoo with the full attention of a man who has arrived at a verdict. You made a calculation. Now you will face its cost. Dongsoo was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Veronica. Is this what you wanted? He said. His voice was low and there was, to his credit or condemnation, something in it that was not entirely without genuine emotion. Veronica looked at him for the first time in the conversation with her full attention. No, she said. And her voice was steady and warm and completely without cruelty. What I wanted was a husband who saw me. Not just used me. A breath. What's happening now isn't what I wanted. It's what you created. Dongsoo looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked down at the whiskey glass. Kang Min-jae spoke again. You will settle your financial obligations to Ms. Clarke in full, as determined by the legal filings she has made and reviewed by my counsel, who will oversee the process. You will withdraw from the European partnership negotiations you have no legitimate right to conduct, which includes agreements Ms. Clarke originated. You will release any claim on intellectual property she developed. He paused. And you will not contact her again unless she initiates it. And if I don't? Dongsoo said. Kang Min-jae picked up his glass. He took a measured sip. He set it down. He looked at Dongsoo with the expression of a man who has not been asked a question he considers serious in a very long time. Then the threads I am currently holding, he said very quietly, I let go. The meaning of that was clear enough. Dongsoo did not speak for a long time. The room held its silence with the patience of a place that had absorbed many long silences before this one. Finally he said, fine. Not with grace. Not with the dignity of a man who had arrived at wisdom. With the flat resignation of a man who has encountered a wall he cannot scale and is choosing at last to stop running toward it. Veronica nodded once. She did not say thank you. She did not say good. She lifted her glass of whiskey, drank, set it down, and turned her attention back to Kang Min-jae, from whom she had several more items of business to discuss. Dongsoo was shown out of the room 15 minutes later. He did not look back. The dismantling of an empire built on borrowed credibility is not dramatic in the way that films imagine. It is quiet, bureaucratic, achieved in conference rooms and legal offices and the rescheduled meetings that are never rescheduled. It happens in the withdrawal of handshakes, in the polite non-answers to calls, in the gradual shrinking of the world that power had briefly made large. In the 3 months following the meeting at the Yongu Club, HW's strategic group contracted. Not collapsed. Dongsoo was too experienced a survivor for total collapse, but contracted as though the body of the company, having lost its vital organs, was organizing itself around what remained. The European partnership, stripped of the agreements Veronica had originated, reduced to a fraction of its projected scale. The American investor cluster pulled back their capital with language about strategic realignment that everyone understood meant something more specific. Several members of the Hwang syndicate's mid-tier management, men who had operated under the comfortable assumption of Kang Min-jae's network's tacit permission, found that permission quietly revoked in territory disputes that suddenly resolved in ways unfavorable to them. Dongsoo did not need to be told explicitly that this was connected to his situation. He was not a stupid man. He signed the financial settlement documents with Veronica's attorneys in the first week of February. Every document, every clause. The total was significant. A recognition of not just marital assets but the calculated value of her intellectual contributions, which her legal team had documented with the meticulous precision she had herself provided. He signed without contesting a single line. The men across the table from him reported that he was almost unnervingly quiet throughout. Ji-yeon's story ended differently than she had written it for herself. The life she had imagined, the prestige, the social ascendance, the secure position beside a powerful man, eroded with his power. She had not loved Dongsoo, not precisely. She had loved the idea of what he represented and the position she believed she had earned by engineering Veronica's displacement. When that position became less glittering, when the social invitations thinned and the event appearances became awkward, when the women who had initially welcomed her with the sharp warmth of competitors who believe they are on the winning side began to grow cooler, Ji-yeon recalculated. She left him in March. Cleanly, efficiently, with the same tactical precision with which she had arrived. Dongsoo, who had destroyed a real partnership for a calculated one, was left with neither. Veronica heard about Ji-yeon's departure through her attorney, who mentioned it in passing at the end of a call about the settlement's final disbursements. She received the information and then set it aside without elaboration. She did not call anyone to share it. She did not feel the vindictive satisfaction that she suspected people expected her to feel. What she felt was something quieter and more complex. A vast, settled sadness for the waste of it. For the years given, for the marriage that had been real before it was ruined, for the man Dongsoo had been in those early years in Seoul when he had looked at her like she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. She allowed herself to grieve that man, the early one, the one who had cooked for her badly in his apartment and laughed too loud at industry mixers, and then she released him. Not with bitterness. With the finality of a woman who has honored what was real and refuses to pretend that what came after was the same thing. She told her mother about the settlement on a Sunday afternoon call. Claudette was quiet for a moment and then said, "And now what?" "Now," Veronica said, "I build." She had been building already, in fact, in the margins of everything else. The business plan she had started drafting in London had grown into something substantial. A brand strategy and communications firm with a specific focus on cross-cultural markets, particularly the intersection of African and Asian business ecosystems, a territory she knew with a fluency that was genuinely rare. She had begun quiet conversations with 2 potential partners, a Korean-American woman she had known from her Chicago business school years, and an investment strategist based in Lagos who had been in her network for 4 years. She had given the firm a name. Veronica Clarke and Associates. Her name. First and last. The name she had been born with, the name her mother had given her, the name that had traveled from Chicago to Seoul and back and survived everything the journey had done to it. There was a particular satisfaction in putting that name on paper that she could not fully articulate and did not try to. It simply felt like the exact right thing, the way that certain decisions feel less like choices and more like arrivals. Summer arrived in Chicago the way it always did, with the particular audacity of a city that has survived a long winter and intends to be noticed about it. Veronica stood at the window of her new office on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop, looking out at the lake with the early morning light flat and gold on the water. The office was still being fitted out, boxes of materials in the corners, her degrees and certifications waiting to be hung, but she had chosen to come in early today before the movers, before her partners, before the noise of the beginning. She wanted a moment alone with what she had built. 7 months had passed since the Grand Joseon Hotel. It felt, depending on the hour, like a year ago or like yesterday. The body carries certain memories differently than the mind does. The mind can analyze and distance and contextualize, but the body knows what it knows, and sometimes the knowing surfaced unexpectedly. A piece of music in a restaurant, the smell of a particular cologne, the sight of a couple walking with the unconscious ease of two people who still trusted each other. In those moments she let the feeling move through her and then set it down and kept going. This was not stoicism. This was the particular practice of a woman who had decided that her pain was allowed to exist but was not allowed to govern. She had done the work. The therapy, the honest conversations with her mother and her closest friends, the long walks that had started in Notting Hill and continued after she returned to Chicago. She had cried exactly as much as she needed to, in private, with the full-throated unperformed grief of someone who had genuinely loved someone and genuinely lost them. She had let it be ugly and real. And then she had stood up. The settlement from the HW Strategic Group proceedings had provided her with significant capital. She had supplemented it with a seed investment from a boutique firm that had looked at her background and her plan and had seen, with the particular intelligence of people who know how to recognize value, exactly what she was. What she had always been. Veronica Clarke and Associates had launched 6 weeks ago with 3 clients. A Korean beauty brand seeking to penetrate African markets, an African technology company building a presence in Southeast Asia, and a US-based investment fund wanting to reposition its brand after a period of public criticism. All 3 had come to her specifically. All 3 had been referred by people who knew her work, who had seen what she had done with HW Strategic Group and had noted, with their own careful intelligence, that the sophistication that company had possessed had a single, named origin. She had spent the last month in client meetings, pitch presentations, and strategic consultations that reminded her, viscerally, powerfully, why she had chosen this work in the first place. She was brilliant at it. Not in the way of someone going through professional motions, but in the way of someone whose mind was genuinely, joyfully, most alive when given a complicated problem and the space to solve it. Kang Min-jae had sent her a card when the firm launched. Handwritten. 3 lines. You built something real the first time and they tried to erase it. The second time it has your name on it. I wish you every success. She had kept the card. Their relationship existed in a register she did not have an easy word for. Not friendship exactly, not the transactional alliance that their first meeting might have suggested, but something like mutual respect between 2 people who had seen each other clearly in a difficult moment and found what they saw admirable. He had called once in the months since, briefly, to confirm that the settlement proceedings had concluded to his satisfaction and that she was, as he put it, clear of the complications. She had thanked him without excess. He had told her none was needed. She had asked him, in that call, a question she had been holding for months. Why did you care? Genuinely. You could have let it go. It wasn't your business. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, because the world has too many people who watch a wrong thing happen and decide it is not their concern. I decided a long time ago that this was not the kind of man I wanted to be. The business of correcting wrongs within my reach is part of my code. It has nothing to do with politics or sentiment. And the fact that it cost Dongsoo, that didn't trouble you? He made choices, Kang said. All choices have costs. He knew that better than most. He simply forgot to account for the cost of underestimating you. She had sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Underestimating her. That was, finally, the core of it. Not the betrayal of the affair. Marriages crumble for complicated reasons, and she had made her peace with the part of that story that had been simple human failure. But the calculation that she could be replaced, that her contributions could be absorbed and her presence erased, that the life they had built together was something he had built and she had merely accompanied, that was the thing that had been wrong. That was the disrespect that had drawn Kang Min-jae's attention because it was the disrespect he understood, in his bones, was the kind that destabilizes everything. And Dongsoo had learned it. That was the thing she was certain of, even having last seen him in that small dark-paneled room in Yonggu. She was not certain he had learned it from the right place, from genuine accountability rather than consequence, but the lesson had arrived nonetheless. The man who had believed he could remove her from the equation and watch the equation solve itself had discovered what the equation actually contained. She did not know what Hwang Dongsoo's life looked like now, and she had decided that this was correct. She had let his story go. She was not its custodian. She was the custodian of her own. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill. A message from her Chicago partner. Movers are 20 minutes out. Stopping for coffee. You want anything? She smiled and typed back, bring me whatever you're having. She turned back to the window. The lake caught the light and gave it back in 1,000 fragments. Chicago sprawled beneath her, her city, the city that had made her, the city that had waited for her to come back to herself. She thought about the woman who had stood at the entrance of the Grand Joseon Hotel in a midnight gown, waiting for a husband who arrived with someone else on his arm. She thought about the grief and the fury and the particular iron dignity with which that woman had walked out of a room she had built, refusing to let 200 witnesses see her break. She was proud of that woman. She was proud of every version of herself that had existed since. The woman on the plane to London, the woman at the kitchen table with the laptop, the woman in a Mayfair dining room who had taken a meeting with one of the most powerful men in Seoul's underworld and kept her composure entirely and negotiated for the protection of her own dignity without pretending she was helpless. She was proud of who she had been in the dark parts. And she was proud of who she was now, standing in early summer light with her name on the door and her mind fully, finally, unapologetically her own. There is a particular kind of freedom that only comes from the other side of the thing you thought would finish you. Veronica Clarke had learned this not as an abstraction but as an embodied truth, as a thing known in the body before it is understood by the mind. She had walked through fire not because she was invincible but because she was unwilling. Unwilling to break. Unwilling to disappear. Unwilling to let someone else's small imagination of who she was become the story she told herself. She had been loved and betrayed and humiliated and protected and rebuilt, and she had arrived here, in this light, in this city, with her name on the door and her work in her hands, and she was not simply okay. She was magnificent. The elevator opened behind her. The movers arrived. The day began. Veronica Clarke turned from the window, squared her shoulders and went to work. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it when Veronica walked out of the ballroom with her head up? Or when she sat calm and composed in that room beside Kang Min-jae, or when she put her own name on the door? And if you haven't already, subscribe, because Veronica's story is the kind of story this channel was built to tell.